Hey, what's up, homeboy? Hey, let's check you out. You look strong, man. Looking pretty good. That's nice purple sword. Oh, attack power boots. Oh, you looking good, Holmes. Man, you looking good, man. I see you out there. I see you out there. I'll be seeing you.
Hey everybody, before we get started, I just wanted to say, if you enjoy our content and want to stay up to date with our videos, hit the subscribe button. It really helps the channel. Thanks. So, on to the video.
Hello and welcome back to my channel, Random Drop. And this week I want to talk about Greed is Good. Now, this is not necessarily a full review of Greed is Good, but more of my thoughts of the early access at this time. So yeah, technically I guess I'm reviewing the early access. But it is impossible to talk about this game without talking about Dark and Darker. Now, Dark and Darker made splashes, what is it, about a year ago now, or maybe just under a year ago. It came out as a very unique idea, kind of using ideas from games like Tarkov, The Hunt, PUBGs, and Battle Royales to create this really unique PvP and PvE dungeon crawling mode, right? Where you are scouring through dungeons, collecting loot, killing monsters, but you could run into players, kill them, take their loot, and build up power over time using a class system. Very, very specific movement and menus and speed. It is all tuned in a way to a very specific feel, and people seem to really like it, and there's many playtests of it, people really enjoying it. Then the legal issues came, the game kind of disappeared for a bit, came back, and now is up and running on Iron Mace's website. You can pay $30 to play the game. It's in active development, but all that legal stuff is happening in the background. As for the purpose of this video, we're just going to assume they're being truthful and that Dark and Darker was the first one with this idea and wasn't robbed from anything, and we're going to go with that Greed is Good is the copy or the one inspired by it, by however you want to go about it. But this is not really a review of or a versus video, but I'm going to use a lot of my comparisons of Greed is Good to Dark and Darker because many people have played that game, and really the main great thing about Greed is Good in itself is the things that it looked at and was like, hey, we'll do that differently, and it is what attached me to the game itself. And yeah, just a little bit more on Dark and Darker. That game is we played quite a bit of it and really tried to get into it, but that player base is far gone, or like super deep into that game. It's very hard as a new player to get into it and get gear and progress. It's gonna take long hours and a lot of grinding to eventually get to that point, because those players know how to play the game, know those areas, right? It is going into it's like going into Apex like fucking for the first time in year 5, right? You're gonna get destroyed by other players, but there's the added system of loot on top of it, to where in Dark and Darker you're running around and getting just blown up in one shot by teams and full sets of loot while you're barely scraping around to get grazed. So we gave that game quite a large chance and just kept bouncing off of it. But Greed is Good grabbed our attention because it kind of was a bit more lenient on that stuff. And not to say that that's a bad thing about Dark and Darker, but Dark and Darker is a much more hardcore game. The enemies are way more brutal. The speed and gameplay is a lot slower and more focused, but a lot of the core systems and the core idea the games share are very similar or pretty much exactly the same. But how the two games kind of looked at them and then kind of diverged off that path is what we're talking about here today, right? And what I enjoy about Greed is Good the most. Dark and Darker made very specific design choices to keep a certain feel for the game, right? The attacks are a certain way, the monsters are a certain way, the way castings and those systems are there for a certain way. The auction system is set up in a certain way just to invoke a certain feel. I personally just don't have the time to mess with that type of stuff. Part of me wants to call it jank, but it's done very purposefully to, again, get a very specific feel and more manual and less automated. But I'm not really the type to sit there and like try to auction an item off in a chat room Like I kind of just want to sell the item and like go into the next match, right? And again, that's where you start seeing these differences in ideology. Again, Dark and Darker is a more hardcore game. Dark and Darker is trying to be more like Dungeons and Dragons, while Greed is Good is trying to be like more like an MMO. And you can see like kind of and how some characters are designed in Greed is Good. It's like, oh, that's just a frost mage from World of Warcraft. It does a frost nova, throws a blizzard, and it has an ice shield that slows, right? The fire mage has a shield, it throws big fireballs, and has a blink, and it has like a dragon breath attack. Again, it's very similar. So they've clearly inspired by World of Warcraft and Greed is Good. So yeah, let's get into it, right? So let's start with like the good things I like about Greed is Good and what it excels. The overall arcing theme of, if you've played the two games, Greed is Good is much more streamlined and is a lot easier to get into for just an average player, but there is that depth if you want to get more hardcore about it. And we'll get into more of that stuff, right? But like the way itemization is, the way the casting and the classes work, there is that depth, right? You're not going to, I think Dark and Darker wants to have talent trees at some point. You're not really doing that and getting that in depth, right? But there's a character, it has its abilities, and you can tune it here and there. And the game is overall filled with many smart changes. One of the highlights and changes is that when you go into the lobby and even in combat or in the dungeon, you can see the three main pieces of gear on your enemy: the helmet, the chest piece, and the pants. That way, when you're running into that group, you can clearly see their markings and clearly tell it's a player as well. But you can clearly see their, basically you can see their power level, right? And you can see like, hey, maybe we shouldn't fuck with those people. And so there's a lot of matches where you like run up to people and like, maybe we shouldn't. Or, hey man, they probably got some good stuff. Let's go kill them. And there'll be times when you're in the lobby and you're like, oh, I'm the big dog. I'm the most geared person here. Let's rock it. And there'll be lobbies where you go in and everyone is similarly geared and it's a freaking bloodbath. And your thoughts are, we're probably not going to make it out of here alive. We should try to get a blue portal. There's no point going to the second level because the team in full purples is going to rock our shit in. Another good quality of life change is the damage numbers. You can see them in combat. You can see them in the dungeon. Sadly, Dark and Darker doesn't do that. It only does it in the main lobby on the target dummy. It feels much better when you can actually see the numbers in combat and to see how much stronger you're getting whenever you're dealing damage and getting better gear. Again, I imagine it's an aesthetic thing with Dark and Darker. They're trying to keep a very, very particular feel with that game and understand it, but I'm very much the type who like, does this really add anything to the game overall? And I'm the one who would be on the side of like, no, let's add damage numbers. Another really good quality of life change as well is when you hit level 5 on the account, you get into the auction house, the auction system. Again, Dark and Darker is very basically like a barter system, right? Where you like sit in the chat and link your items. Like, I'm selling this item for however much gold, and you have to agree to it, right? To not like spam profanity and shit to be in that chat room. And this, it is very streamlined. You put your item for auction, and either people will put orders for that type of item, or you can put your item out and be like, hey, I'm going to sell this for 100 gold, and someone will buy it, right? And it'll be on there. Again, a very MMO auction house. One thing that's very good is that if you know how people like to itemize their characters, you can pick up a green and be like, that has magic attack power on it. This is worth more than everything I've looted so far, right? So there are very much things like that. So you're like, oh, I got a really good item, and it's very easy to sell it because people are seeking out those items. So it makes greens and looting greens not just like ignore them, but I look at them like, are the stats good? Oh, they are. I need to keep this one. And that goes back into itemization later, where a team can be in full blues, but if they're not itemized correctly, and it's just like a bunch of random stats that doesn't help their class, it's just armor and health at that point, and you could probably fight back. The next part we'll get into is the speed of play of Gabe, right? Overall, the speed of the game is, there's very little downtime. Now, the objective of the game is still to explore and venture through the dungeon while trying to either attack or avoid players, but you're trying to survive and gain. Now, the dungeon is not as hard as it is in Dark and Darker. There are harder monsters and mobs that you can focus on that drop better things. But overall, like, compared to going to Dark and Darker, the monsters in Dark and Darker are fucking brutal. And they will wear you down very quickly if you're just taking a couple hits. You could take a couple hits and Greed is Good. You still get whittled down if you're like just not paying attention and not playing correctly. But again, you don't get wear down as fast. There's health potions and gifted health potions they give you when you zone in. They kind of spawn a lot. Like you kind of see health potions spawn pretty regularly on the map as well. And this helps to keep the speed of play and keep you in the game longer throughout the matches. In Dark and Darker, you could easily look at the kill feed and see just people dying to random monsters. While you really mostly see people die to other players in Greed is Good, and every now and then a monster like just accidentally got someone. But the speed of the game is much more consistent, and Dark and Darker is much slower, right? You have to sit and like recharge your spells and sit and rest. After like your fighter took 3 hits, you have to use all 3 of your heals just to fill them up. And now, like as a cleric, I'm just sitting around all the time. It's just, we don't need that, right? It's so, I found it, again, I understand why it's that way and the feel they're going for. And I just don't personally like that feel. And that's why I've gravitated to Greed is Good overall. It's like, no, I want to fight things. I want to move forward. I want to heal when I be able to heal. And if I mismanage my mana, that's my fault. But the fact that like, oh, I only have 3 spell slots or whatever, 3 slots, and I have to sit down for 5 minutes to get 2 of them back, is just, it's aggravating, man. So it makes like every little mistake in Darker and Darker feel like, man, let's just start over. You got hit by the first mob. What's the point, right? And this leads me into the biggest change and difference in Greed is Good and what sold me on the game. And it's a very simple change. There's an actual lock-on and casting system for spells. Spells use mana. You only can have 4 spells, right? And there's some, as you level up, you can swap in and out, but you can only have 4. They use mana that you regenerate. There's mana regeneration gear and mana gear, so you can cast more, right? But the overall casting system is, I mean, it's a different thing, right? Again, going from D&D to an MMO, but I just find it so much more fun and intuitive for a video game. Yeah, you can cast heals, but, you cast the heal, has a 10-second cooldown before you can cast it again. That's fine, so you're not spamming it, right? But it actually locks on to the player and heals them. It's a little awkward to try to heal yourself because you kind of got to look at the ground and cast the spell. But trying to heal your friend and putting a shield on them is much simpler. The many hours of play Dark and Darker is fucking frustrating to be in the middle of combat or even just exploring and your friend just moves suddenly and your spell fires off and it hits a wall and it eats the charge and heals no one and nobody. Or you're in the middle of a fight trying to heal your friend and you heal the guy he's fighting instead. Or like and you're trying to shield them and you miss them 3 times as they're moving around. And don't say it's like, oh, get good or whatever like that. It's so goddamn finicky. And there's times where you cast spells on the ground in Dark and Darker and they just don't even spawn. Like the Locust spell, I've dropped so many times and just nothing fucking happens. It says I didn't cast the spell. It's like, okay, whatever. But the overall, again, casting system and the way the casters are built, I think is just a lot more fun to play. And I think maybe there are bigger powerhouses in Dark and Darker and like easier to be a giant powerhouse. But the way like the casters are built, specifically like the Fire and Ice Mage are built in 2 different ways. One's more offensive, one's more crowd control-y. It goes into that MMO aesthetic. And again, with the lock-on system and the spells having really great effects. Like when you see a Frost Nova happen, you fucking see the giant spike and the person rooted, it's time to attack. And it goes for other things too, like the abilities, like with the Ranger dropping the trap. It's not like this fucking, you can just drop it in front of you and someone will walk into it, right? And there's many other things as well where like it just feels a lot smoother, even with the abilities and spell casting, right? But again, the biggest thing is, again, the way spell casting works. It's just a lot more playable, way less frustrating. Because it sucks to be the caster on your team and you're trying to you feel freaking useless because half your spells are missing or you only have so many. While in a fight with my cleric in Greed is Good, it's like I put a shield on you and then I heal you back to full, put another shield and rotate those spells to keep people in combat longer. And you have this bigger, back and forward if you're playing correctly. And it felt like we could be a lot more precise and strategic in Greed is Good, while in Dark and Darker, it felt like either an item level powerhouse gets stomped, or it's 2 teams kind of just doing that, and hopefully it works out. And usually it's like the first person who attacked or who had the better positioning is the one who wins, right? And again, that's overall adds to the speed of play. The game is a lot more focused and faster. And that goes with the progression. You're constantly getting XP and leveling every round. The longer you go in each round, you level your character. and you get nice little extra bonus things for leveling up, right? It's not like, sadly, with Dark and Darker, if you're not level 20, you might as well not have been playing at a certain point. You're so substantially weaker. There's core class perks that you do not have on because you could only equip one perk in Dark and Darker. There's so many like just crazy things in that perk system, and because you're literally missing 3 of them when you start, you're so much. It's just brutal being a new player in that game. Meanwhile, with how the system is set up here and the leveling and the characters, they're designed in a specific way to do a job with a couple little tricks on the side that you could throw in and tune, but doesn't vastly change the character at all, right? Like the thief in Dark and Darker could probably make like 3 characters compared to the thief or the assassin in Greed is Good, right? The slew of perks that class has in Dark and Darker, this is like a giant ass list, while the Greed is Good rogue is a lot more limited, but you don't have to unlock all that bullshit and you're like stronger off the gate, right? And again, that leads to the overall progression, and that combined with the auction system, eventually you can get things rolling, get money rolling in, and start getting into matches with gear, and eventually getting brave enough to go to the second level and go in deeper and get even better loot and try to escape from there. Down in the second level is where if there was any other geared people in the match, they probably went down there too, and that's probably where the big fights will happen. There's nice times where you'll have a match and wipe out the other geared group and be like, yeah, I knew it was those other guys, and you know the bottom is probably going to be clear or filled with people with not much gear, and you go in there and reap the rewards. But it is a risk overall, but that's the loop I liked about the game, right? It's like eventually getting to that point where I could start selling items, and then I could start building sets, and we start winning fights up top, and then we're like, hey, this is going good, let's go to the second level, and making out of the second level with a bunch of money and gear that we had never gotten before, and going through that loop and loop again. But this is where I go into the negatives, and it's a very simple negative, and it's very sad, is that this game came out second or third or whatever the hell. This game came out after Dark and Darker, and it just looked, rather than people giving it a shot, or because, you know, fandoms are weird and shit, and like game fandoms are so stupid, but rather than giving it a shot, there's lots of people who look at this game and just see a sheer copy. But there's a lot of good ideas in this game that are worth trying, and if you're not really, you like the idea of Dark and Darker, but you're bouncing off of it because getting into it is fucking, it's really brutal. It is very brutal to get into that game. The point of entry on this one is a lot easier to get into, but the player count is much lower. The game has just come out of early access for like a week or two. Since this recording, we're getting full lobbies for like 2 or 3 weeks, right? And we're having a blast. But this past week, we've noticed that there's less and less players, and the game hasn't really done much advertising. So right now the player count is really good, right now the player count's really low, and we're getting into more matches where like you're seeing a lot of the same people, or it's just no new bloods, or maybe it's like one other geared team in the match. We went to a high roller once and no one else queued for it, and it's like, what's the point at that point? It just sadly, it just needs an injection of players. There is a price tag behind the game of $12, which is really cheap, but they should have just made it free. Hopefully they do at some point. I think they're thinking about adding global servers, but right now the player count is a concern. It wasn't a concern at the start for a couple weeks, but it is an early access game, and it's harder to get. Usually you see lobbies of 12 or 15 people. You're not getting the full 18. Sometimes it's hard to even get 10. It depends when you play, obviously. But the player count is a concern at this time. I hope the devs have laid out a roadmap, and there's going to be a couple new classes and an ice map soon. But we need, hopefully they announce soon, like, hey, this is our marketing plan to get an injection of players in the game, because they need to either pay some streamers to play it or something. But we need more eyeballs on this game overall. It is a good game. It is worth trying out. And the systems and the changes it's made give it its own feel. And I mean, this is the next like really like negative. It's the really like what I think initially makes people go is the fact that both of them use the store-bought assets on the Unreal. So the pots look the same, a lot of the walls look the same. I hope at some point they go back in and kind of try to differentiate themselves a bit. They do in the lighting and how the dungeons look overall, but man, there's no reason those pots should look the same and stuff like that. Again, there's a bunch of different other assets they do use that are different, but like how the walls look, how the gates look, it's just, it needs to find its own look to separate itself, because both of them are using the generic ass Unreal Engine assets that they purchased, and should realistically in game dev, those should be placeholder. Eventually you replace them with your own thing, right? Let's see how far this goes. And the game can be a little bit buggy. Sometimes there'll be times where like I can't loot things on the ground, but only things on bodies. Overall, like in terms of connection, every now and then you get a laggy match, but they've been pretty solid overall. There's lots of posts when the game came out like, oh, hackers. Like every game has hackers. I've played hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of this game, and we've never run into a group where we felt like, oh, they're hacking. We've run into groups that are like, oh, they're so well itemized that they're mages in full magic gear, and we know because we inspected them after we died, and the mages in full magic gear just blasting people, and you know they're decked because you'll see in the kill feed. Person kills XX, like one person kills like 5 people. It's like, oh, that dude is decked. And again, it's not a hack because we ran into them. And it's just, they're a fire mage, man. And they can blow people up if you stack magic damage. They're just a smart player and risking, because magic damage gear is super expensive. So they are risking an immense amount of money. And the game is still got a long way to go, man. It's early access. But my main hope is we just need an injection of players to get more testing, try different things out. But overall, I don't feel like anything's like too broken or overpowered. Like we're having a blast trying different things. I think the game is in a good place and just needs to be worked on and tuned and just get more eyeballs on it, really, and put it to free to play. And maybe you could count that as negative, is that this next point is like where I'm neutral, right? Instead of a class system, the game does a character system, so it's a character that represents a class archetype. And these characters are more limited in a way, right? They have slightly fewer spells than like they would in Dark and Darker, but they're like, maybe, oh, here's Cleric 1, maybe in the future they'll release Cleric 2 with a different kit, right? So the instead of doing classes, they're doing characters, and the characters are they're a lot prettier looking, right? They're like Korean MMO models and stuff. They're made to sell skins, obviously, and some of the skins on some of these characters look really good. So it's nice to like, oh, hey, I hate wearing a burlap sack every match. I want to look cool, and you can do that on your character, right? But yeah, again, that's something I feel neutral on. It's a game where it's only asking for $12, but they are going to be doing transactions obviously in the future. But hopefully, you know, they remove that price tag so we can get people in on the game. But $12 is very, very cheap. And the other thing I'm neutral on is itemization. Everything you loot is random. So every time you loot a piece of gear, be blue, epic, purple, legendary, what determines its status is damage rating, armor rating, all that. And then by each tier, there's another perk it can get, right? So green can only have 1 stat type, blue 2, purple 3, legendaries 4. But they can be completely random and not match your class at all. There's not like how in Darker has strength and agility. Those raw stats are just good. So even if you find the right piece of gear, even if the substat sucks, the raw stat is still pretty good and makes your character more powerful. And in this game, it's just giving you raw armor and health. And if the substats aren't there, it's not really doing much other than giving you whatever the substat does, like resistances or something. On my barbarian, I stacked attack speed because they got big, meaty attacks, but they're slow. So attack speed, hey, do it faster, right? Or on a magic caster, you want to stack magic damage so that whenever you actually get a spell out, it's devastating. And again, we've run into mages who have stacked that. With the rogue as well, you want to stack attack damage so that when you pop out, try to do as much damage as possible. But maybe you're a little bit more of a scared rogue and you're like, man, I really need... Sometimes as a rogue, you can like pop out and get cleaved. Like the guy accidentally kills you because they're just cleaving and you just get on the way, right? But you have very low health. So maybe you stack vitality instead. So I'm very neutral on the system because it makes not every green bad, right? And you can find greens with good stats and those are sellable in the auction house and you can make a lot of money. But there's also just a lot of just trash. There's a huge difference between a character that is properly statted out and got the stats they want and a character who's just throwing random shit on. And that's what will determine, you know, these large fights in a lot of ways, right? Because if you're just throwing random stuff on and not looking at what you're putting on, then you're putting yourself at a disadvantage at that point. And that's me. That's all I got. I think Greed is Good is a really good game that people should check out and give a chance. They did bounce off of Dark and Darker because, again, Dark and Darker is pretty brutal to get into. And if you like Dark and Darker, that's great. and I hope that game grows and is successful, and they don't lose their whatever fucking lawsuits are happening with them. And I hope Greed is Good grows into its own thing and try to focus on what it does well. Try to change up some visuals a bit so like it looks like a different game, because when you just like look at its menu straight, they're a bit too similar. But it is a good example of you could take the same game design idea and put it on paper, but it's all depending on how you tune the game and pace it. You can make a very different game just by changing how much health mobs have. How does itemization work? How does casting work? And is it a mana or a slot system? You can make very different games. It's literally the same idea, but the internals and the guts are different and can make a pretty different experience. And I found that Greed is Good is a more streamlined experience for myself, and I really had fun doing the PvP combat in the game, and the PvE dungeoneering is kind of there just to facilitate that, to give you an arena and for treasure to look for. But I really enjoy just going toe to toe with other players and duking it out. How do you feel? Have you tried Greed is Good? I recommend it. Like, comment, subscribe, and I will see you on the next random drop video. Peace.